like the idea of the gut microbiome didn't even come into my vocabulary until like a couple years ago, I feel. So could you just explain like on a basic level, like what it is and
Yeah.
why it's so important?
So we have tons of different like microbiomes in our body. We have like a skin microbiome, an oral microbiome, and basically various regions on our body harbor these microorganisms, which are not just bacteria. A lot of times we reduce it to only bacteria, but they also include yeast, fungi, and even viruses that are just natural to our, we would call them just normal flora. And they may kind of live in like a symbiotic relationship with us. They may provide us with some benefits. We may provide them with benefits from hosting them within our body. But the gut is really the large focus of a lot of research on the microbiome because we have trillions of bacteria that reside within our gut. And to date, we have over 1,000 different species that have been identified of different bacteria that live within our gut. And so largely a lot of the research has focused on just identifying who is there. And like you mentioned, you've only come into like real like noticing like the term gut microbiome come up, and it's really in science to in the broad like realm of science, it's incredibly young. We've really only been studying this for 20 or so years, 10 years really focusing on the gut microbiome. And so there's so much that we need to learn. And largely a lot of the research up until this point has just focused on identifying who's there, which we now know that that's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily tell us the whole picture, because who's there doesn't always tell us what they're doing. And what they're doing is thought to be more beneficial or more of how they are exerting their effects within our body, because our gut is pretty, in most people, outside of GI illnesses or certain diseases, our gut is a pretty tight environment, closed environment, pretty separate from the rest of our body. And that makes sense. We don't need bacteria floating around our bloodstream. Otherwise, that's sepsis and not compatible with life, very deadly. Um, and so the way in which these bacteria largely communicate with the other regions of our body are through production of metabolites that then influence certain cell signaling pathways and other processes within the body. And so the large metabolites that have been focused on for most of the time that research has been done on the gut microbiome are something called short chain fatty acids. And these are basically what the name implies. They're very small fatty acids. There's three primary ones: acetate, propionate, and butyrate, and they have various functions throughout the body. So butyrate is thought to be the like quote unquote most beneficial of the three, in that it is used within the intestine and the colon cells pretty extensively, and helps them maintain like a healthy barrier, helps with their cell turnover. But then acetate, propionate, and butyrate systemically can have differential effects on cell signaling pathways. And so they can influence certain metabolic pathways throughout the body. And it's thought that they can be, to an extent, anti-inflammatory. But there is also kind of a interaction with them, like more of something is not always necessarily a good thing. So in individuals with at really high weights, some of them tend to exhibit very high levels of short chain fatty acids. And that's thought to potentially contribute to their like energy. They seem to be have a greater capacity at harvesting energy. So these short chain fatty acids get produced from the fermentation and metabolism of like largely dietary fiber. So like I said, fiber for us doesn't contribute much calories because we can't break it down physically using our enzymes, but our microbes can. And when they produce short chain fatty acids, that does give fiber a level of caloric value because it can, those fatty acids can be metabolized as fatty acids. So it's thought that certain individuals have a greater propensity to producing short chain fatty acids, and that may push them into a more of a like a positive energy balance where they are going to be gaining more weight because they may not be eating more, but they may just be harvesting more energy. And so that's like another area in kind of like the obesity systems map, in which we know that obesity is a multifactorial issue. It's not just caused by, it's not willpower based. It's genetically driven, it's socioeconomic status driven, and then it could be possibly driven by your microbiome as well. So yeah, the large way in which our bacteria communicate with us systemically is through production of different metabolites. And they also can produce certain neurotransmitters, aid in certain vitamin production, and some hormone production. So we're learning more and more each day about the role in which they play on our like overall health through those mechanisms.
Is it safe to say typically when it comes to gut microbiome that like diversity is important, or are we looking for like high volumes of specific types of bacteria in our gut?
So we tend to, based on most of the research that is out there, a greater diversity is typically correlated with better health outcomes, largely just for the functional capacity that would exist with having a greater diversity. Is just, you have the capacity for doing all of the different various metabolic functions that the microbes are providing us with if you just have more different species there. So we do tend to believe that a greater diversity is more beneficial. And it's kind of what researchers label as like a healthy microbiome, is if you have a large amount of diversity. But again, there are limitations to that, because we can feed individuals certain high fiber diets and their diversity can actually go down, but we know those high fiber diets are beneficial for overall health. So it's not always black and white, but nothing in nutrition is ever black and white. So
Yeah.